Hi, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the University of Houston virtual campus. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm Sandra Zollman, Director of the Art History Program at the University of Houston. This afternoon, we have David Joselit joining us. And I wanted to introduce our series first. This series reflects the intellectual investments of our faculty
Can't hear
and...
you, son. Can't. Oh. I can hear you now.
Okay, great.
I think I turned off my sound. Sorry.
Wonderful. I hope everyone out there can hear me as well. I'm Sandra Zollman, Director of the Art History Program at the University of Houston. This series reflects the intellectual investments of our faculty and of our graduate students in our MA program, now in its 10th year. It complements the work our students do in the classroom, as well as the many paid internships and instructional assistantships they hold that amplify their studies. Houston is the most diverse city in the United States, and as such, as my colleagues Natalie Haran and Dorota Bitchell and I were conceiving this convening, we felt the particular urgency of addressing the global contemporary here in Houston. Thinking locally about the implications of the global, we are not here merely to celebrate the global contemporary paradigm, but to critically interrogate its emergence, its influence, and its implications for the future of our work as researchers, teachers, and curators. We wanted to ask, what is global contemporary art, and how is it remaking approaches to artistic practice, scholarship, curation? In a moment of cultural reckoning that has rendered past efforts at diversifying and expanding the canon insufficient, how can the idea of global contemporary art help us to critically and ethically engage in the reconstruction of what has been a historically exclusive discipline? As academic programs and museums adopt this rhetoric, along with its weaknesses and blind spots, is global contemporary art here to stay? We originally conceived this as an in-person convening back in 2019, and we're grateful to receive support from the University of Houston's Division of Research for this programming. Circumstances now allow us to have a go at a truly global conversation, and we invite you to enter your questions in the chat window at any time. After Professor Joselit's remarks, we will get to as many audience questions as time allows before our program ends at 4 Central Time. So if you'd like to ask your question verbally, please raise your hand using the raise your hand function, and we will call on you, and you'll see a window inviting you to unmute yourself and speak. If you want to ask your question in the chat, that is perfectly fine too. My colleague, Dorota Bitchell, will be monitoring the chat, and now I'm going to pass the virtual microphone to my colleague, Natalie Haran, who will introduce our speaker, David Joselit.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you all for being here today. I'm chiming in from what appears to be the Louvre Abu Dhabi in homage to David's book, which we're excited to hear more about today. But I'm actually in my office in Houston, and in fact, Sandra's right in the office behind this wall, so I can hear her. I'm so excited to introduce David Joselit, who began his career as a curator at the ICA Boston from 1983 to 1989. He has taught at the University of California, Irvine, Yale University, where he was department chair from 2006 to 2009, and the CUNY Graduate Center. He is currently professor of art, film, and visual studies at Harvard. Joselit is author of Infinite Regress, Marcel Duchamp, 1910 to 1941, published by MIT in 1998, American Art since 1945, Thames and Hudson, 2003, Feedback, Television Against Democracy, MIT, 2007, and After Art, Princeton University Press, 2012. He co-organized the exhibition Painting 2.0, Expression in Information Age, which opened at the Brandhorst Museum in Munich in 2015. Joselit is an editor of the journal October and writes regularly on contemporary art and culture. And his most recent book, for which he is here today, is Heritage and Debt, Art in Globalization, published by MIT Press. So a hearty global welcome to you, David. Thanks again for being with us, and I will let you go ahead and share your screen.
Great. Thank you, Natalie, Sandra, and Dorota for this terrific invitation. And I'm excited about the dialogue both today and with the other great speakers that you've lined up and our final discussion in a couple of weeks. So let me just do exactly that and share my screen. And here we go. So in fact, my book is not a pure celebration of globalization, but an effort to really think about what globalization is using art as an archive. So I'm very focused in this text on trying to understand how both museums and individual works of art act as agents within globalization as opposed to merely representing or reflecting globalization. So my point, I work quite hard throughout the text not to make this into a kind of geographical survey, but rather a kind of frame of reference for doing history at a time when multiple parallel histories, often contradictory histories, need to be taken into account at once. So that, in a way, is the theme of my short talk today. It has to do with the question of history, how we're challenged by globalization to tell history differently, and how we might approach that problem and how certain artists have done so as well. But I'll focus really on, after a brief, broad introduction, not an introduction to the book, but a kind of introduction to the themes of history and its the necessity for rethinking it, both within art history and beyond. And then I'll look at a very specific example that I hope will dramatize these questions of parallel and even opposing kinds of histories. So with that, let me just start. At a time of crisis, with the convergence of a global pandemic and demands for racial justice in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the murder of other African Americans at the hands of the police, critical forms of history have never been more important. In my book, Heritage and Debt, I argue that the ideology of imperialism, which deployed systemic racism as one of its primary tools, of course, in order to justify conquering people of other beliefs, other regions, other customs and cultures. Systematic racism allowed imperialism to claim ownership over the future through a self-identification with progress and modernity. In other words, the West tried to make itself in the image of progress, and by doing so, rendered other parts of the world, consigned them to the past. Aesthetically, this claim over the future, over modernity, corresponds to the avant-garde strategy within European art of formal and conceptual rupture, but it assumes manifold other forms in other realms, such as industrialization, etc., urbanization. By consigning non-Western cultures to the past, the West's claim over the future, both in terms of technology and culture, served as a kind of justification, of course not a legitimate one, but an ideological justification for enslavement, conquest, and exploitation. In short, and here really is my brief schematic salvo about history, time was wielded as a weapon. By claiming the future, the West rendered the rest of the world derivative, in debt to the West. And this is where, partly where my term debt comes from in the title Heritage and Debt. This is why I think still today, when we're dealing so poignantly and dramatically with white supremacy, with an encounter with white supremacy and an accounting of it, why history is so important. Because in fact, these forms of imperialism, colonization, white supremacy are encoded in how we tell histories and how we value historical narratives. As many indigenous and post-colonial artists and thinkers have insisted, a powerful response to this ideological dead end, that is the idea that the West owns the future, the West wields time as a weapon, is to reclaim possible futures by reanimating diverse experiences of the past. And again, I need to really state explicitly how indebted I am in making these arguments to both Native scholars, First Nation scholars, and also post-colonial scholars. In short, it is necessary to pluralize our definition of modernity, not through pallid forms of multiculturalism that can too easily devolve into tokenism, but rather through an epistemological shift in how modernity is defined and how its histories are recounted. In other words, we really have to rethink what we mean by the modern before we can even begin to come to terms with the contemporary. In Heritage and Debt, I argue that the heterogeneous array of artworks that constitute global contemporary art arise from encounters between three distinct modern genealogies that developed in tandem with European modernism, sometimes in conflict with them, but I don't want to say, I don't want to inscribe a hierarchy here between them, even though the Euro-American modernist genealogy is by far the best known within the discipline of art history and the most celebrated. So in the book, I characterize and sketch these genealogies in three typologies. One is the post-colonial modern, typical of places that experienced settler colonialism, as in Africa, where artists were both alienated from indigenous traditions and excluded from European training. So they were both, this is what I mean by using time as a weapon to some degree. Their past was both foreclosed to them by colonial rulers, but nor were they given access to European idioms of art training. So that the post-colonial is one model. A second is socialist realism, which we'll talk about today in the Chinese context, where in China and the Soviet Union, for instance, modernism adhered more in a new mode of mass spectatorship, of image culture, as opposed to formal innovation. In other words, modernism had to do with creating popular culture using the fine arts, as I hope will become somewhat clearer in a few minutes. And finally, the third of these is an underground genealogy of modernity or modernism, which thrived in regions such as Latin America and Eastern Europe, including Russia, where there was a strong connection to European modernism, which was blocked from wide public expression due to authoritarian governments. So I argue, with regard to contemporary art, I argue that in the 1980s, these four genealogies, the three I've named, plus the Euro-American genealogy of modernism, began to be synchronized with one another. In other words, they began to circulate in shared global channels of distribution, what we might just call the art world. And this term synchronization, for me, of these distinct histories is useful because it undermines the hierarchical relation that's posited between a past and a future, something I was talking about at the beginning of my remarks. So if we think about synchronization, what that does is to bring different temporalities into contact with one another. So it could be different experiences of the past that are activated in the present, the future that is projected onto the past, etc. Synchronization suggests, let's say, a plasticity, a composition of temporalities, as opposed to merely a straight line where the past lines up behind the present, which is before the future. But synchronization can also be forced. If we think about just-in-time manufacturing, for instance, where different parts of the world are synchronized on account of their cheap labor with other parts of the world that are financial centers. Synchronization can be a kind of oppressive condition as well as one that can bring cultures into productive conversation with one another. The term synchronization is thus meant to avoid what Boaventura de Sousa Santos has called the fallacy of false contemporaneity. And in a way, this phrase and others that de Sousa Santos uses, the fallacy of false contemporaneity, is very important to how I think about these questions of global contemporary art. I think in a way, the contemporary that we look at is often riven by fallacies of false contemporaneity. So what does that exactly mean? Here is Boaventura de Sousa Santos's description in a rather long quote. Pardon me for reading it at length. So he writes, "This fallacy consists of assuming that the contemporaneity of a given event or behavior is equal for all participants in it." In other words, we may all be on the screen together, but are we in the same moment, really? What he's kind of asking, not of Zoom, obviously, but his example, then he goes on to say, when World Bank officials meet with African peasants, it is assumed that the contemporaneity or coevality of both groups is generated by the simultaneity of the encounter. The fact that the peasants' present reality is conceived by them as a past present. In other words, the fact he's arguing that the peasants are bringing their past with them into the present. The past is not something that is closed off from the present. So that's what I think, that's how I understand his saying. The fact that the peasants' present reality is conceived by them as a past present and by the World Bank as a present past. In other words, that the past is sealed off, has no access to modernity for the World Bank, whereas for the peasant, their past is precisely what enables them to enter into modernity as a force of knowledge and energy that opens to new and different kinds of futures. So the fact that the peasant's present reality is conceived by them as a past present and by the World Bank as a present past, however crucial, gets obscured and goes uncontrolled. So this different relation to history, to pastness, in a contemporary encounter between the peasant and the World Bank is obscured, is invisibilized. And he goes on to finish the passage in the following way. In this context, there is no room to account for the non-contemporaneity of the simultaneous, or most importantly, for different ways of being contemporaneous. So what de Sousa Santos calls the non-contemporaneity of the simultaneous is what I call global contemporary art, basically. I'm arguing that this is precisely what happens to those four different genealogies of modernism, beginning in the 1980s, accelerating in the 90s, and ever since, when these different modes of being past, present, and present past begin to circulate together. The progressive potential of contemporary art's globalization thus lies in making the contingency of the line between the contemporary and the traditional, or the present, past, and future, absolutely explicit. We have to understand that the past is not quantitatively verifiable, that we invent a past every moment of our present as we invent futures. And so it is really about redrawing the boundaries between these temporal signatures, these ideas of pastness and presentness, which are thoroughly saturated with geopolitical power relations, just as the demarcation of territorial borders is, that is at stake in global contemporary art. So this is quite a general set of statements, but what I want to do for the rest of my time with you is to be very specific in terms of one of these kinds of encounters of what one might call cognitive dissonance, or the non-contemporaneity of the simultaneous, to use de Sousa Santos's term. So how can we And by we, I mean people in the United States, which I think most of us are. Though since we're on Zoom, perhaps that's mistaken. How can we in the West understand this work as modern? While its ostensible subject, Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan, alludes to a 1922 miners' strike in Anyuan, after which a good proportion of the strikers became members of the Red Army. The work exemplifies a more generalized kind of what's been called by many scholars of this work and others revolutionary romanticism. It shows a young and resolute ruler standing on a rise, a geographical rise, literally walking into the future with the parting clouds behind him, symbolizing, in the words of the artist, the winds of revolution. So the first thing that's important here to remark upon, just schematically, is that while this might seem as a straightforwardly realist portrayal of the young Mao, it in fact has an enormously well codified set of signifiers that is that are embedded within the landscape. The idea that he is striding forward and that the clouds are parting. Also, the tone of the skin of in representations of Mao were extremely important in terms of the redness, the fleshness, the healthiness of his face. All of these signifiers were deeply saturated with political meanings. So this painting became what was known as a model painting during the Cultural Revolution, which spanned 1966 to 76. This painting near the beginning in 67, as you see. It was endorsed by Jiang Qing, who was the fourth wife of Mao and a powerful member of the Central Cultural Revolution group. In her book, which I depend on enormously, Painters and Politics in the People's Republic of China, Julia F. Andrews gives an account of this painting and how it became a media icon. And her account is very important to how I want to see the development of modernism along the lines of Chinese socialist realism. Jiang Qing saw a photograph of the work of the Lu painting, Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan, in 1967 as part of an application to publish it. So she saw a photograph of this painting. Already it was transposed to a photograph that was propositioned to publish it. She requested that a viewing be held, after which she decided it was a suitable model for Cultural Revolution art. The following year, the People's Daily distributed a color reproduction nationwide. Parades and festivals were organized to commemorate the publication, with pretty girls in blue overalls dancing in front of multiple reproductions of the picture. Here I'm showing you, this isn't exactly what's described in Andrew's book, but here is a group of, on the upper left of the screen, a group of workers parading with, you can see, here's the reproduction. Here the reproduction is being held by a multi-ethnic group of citizens of China. And here is a photograph where a group of workers are holding these reproductions. So not only was it reproduced, but it was greatly celebrated. By the fall of 1968, it was institutionalized as a model painting and copied by aspiring artists throughout China. With the publicity blitz of 1968, almost every Chinese with even the remotest interest in art became aware of Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan. The artist believes that 900 million copies were eventually printed, which if we just stop to, that's the end of the quote from Andrew's book on this period of painting in China. But if we just stop to contemplate what it means that 900 million copies of a painting would be distributed, it's, you know, it's a scale that almost is equivalent to the internet, I would think, in terms of the reach of these reproductions. So what I want to argue is that the modernity of this painting derives not from its formal qualities, though one could make an argument along those lines too, but it would be a little more complex. So let's, for the moment, just say that the modernity of the painting derives not so much from its formal qualities or its position in a sequence of oppositional, stylistic, or critical moves, as in Western art, where, for instance, abstract expressionism is succeeded and in part negated by pop art, which in turn is succeeded by conceptual art, et cetera, et cetera. Rather, the socialist realist model painting, and I think this term, the idea of a model painting or a prototype, is a very interesting kind of object in a certain way. But anyway, the socialist realist model painting is modern on account of its capacity for standardization and mass distribution in the service of consolidating new publics through its creation of arresting icons. So interestingly, painting becomes the prototype for a kind of mass cultural circulation of the image of the leader, the image of Mao during the Cultural Revolution. Let's now develop this argument with, excuse me one second, with a comparison between Liu and Andy Warhol in terms of the relation they establish between fine art and mass public. Because what I want to argue is that what is modern is not a certain kind of form, but a certain kind of structural relationship to the production of a modern public sphere here, or a mass public sphere. So in this sense, they're really quite different, right? Liu's work, the picture of Chairman Mao, is self-consciously a model for reproduction. The painting leads to reproduction. Now, the Warhol, of course, is absolutely the opposite. This painting, as I think many of you in the audience probably know, was based upon a slightly amended version of a headshot of Marilyn Monroe, the great mid-20th century movie star and sex symbol, icon of a certain kind of Hollywood glamour. So if this painting was meant to generate a kind of mass reproduction, this painting, one could say, was meant to arrest that mass reproduction by creating a work, if not unique, because this, for instance, is a print, but of a higher level of value and cultural capital, let's say. So in effect, what we're seeing here, and what this hopefully not too confusing diagram suggests, is that the painting exists on an opposite or converse, in a converse relationship to the mass cultural information streams that in the one case emerge from it in the Chinese setting, and in the other are arrested by it in the American context. They also adopt opposing aesthetic strategies. I mentioned to you a moment ago when I was talking about the different codes that were applied to the representation of Mao during this period, that there is a strong codification and integration of his body with the landscape through a set of allegorical or symbolic assertions of his leadership, his visionary quality, his capacity to literally walk into the future. So one could say that the figure of Mao here is integrated and richly saturated with symbolic significance. The figure of Marilyn Monroe in the context of the work of art, loosely, I guess I can call this a painting, even though technically it's a print, is that the face is disaggregated. Each one of these different colors is made through a different level of silkscreen, a different silkscreen that is used to push through the ink of different colors. So there's one for the yellow hair, one for the blue face. I think this is relatively familiar. But my point here is that famously, Warhol's use of silk screens, multiple silk screens on the same surface, puts the face out of registration. So if on the one hand, the integration of Mao's figure is a model for mass reproduction, the integration of the celebrity's figure is a model for a kind of critical disintegration, or critique, one could say, within the context of Warhol's rendering. Here again, just to show you that the paintings are on a different axis. I think this is where I was going to discuss the aesthetic difference I discussed in the last slide. So we'll just move to the next point. And that is that these works were also consumed in very different ways, and they became property in very different ways. How they were meant to be possessed by a public was extremely different. So on the one hand, we've looked at how Mao Goes to Anyuan became a kind of rallying sign, a way of almost possessing the values and the image of the leader on the part of the people. So there are a multitude of people who possess this multitude of images. Here, and I sort of love this photograph that's taken from Life magazine of one of several prominent collectors of pop art during this period, Leon Krasher, who is sitting in a bedroom, looks like on the phone, surrounded by many versions of Warhol's here and a Lichtenstein here. So instead of the work belonging to the multitude, here the individual person, the bourgeois subject, one could say, owns a multitude of images. So again, we're in a kind of opposing or converse situation where possession is privatized in a very dramatic way in the Western context and made popular in the sense of available to the people, not so much in the sense of being well-liked in the Chinese context. So from a conventional Western art historical point of view, Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan is disqualified from being judged as modern precisely on account of those qualities that give it a different kind of modernity, that give it the modernity of creating a mass-produced public, a contemporary visual culture. And it's important to remember at this point that, of course, one of the things that Mao was trying to do was to take an enormous, diverse country and to fuse together a public sphere that could consolidate his power, but also could create a shared identification. So the role of art in this context was really directed toward creating the apparatus, the conditions of mass culture. And this was what I would argue was modern about this painting. What's modern about Warhol's painting, on the other hand, is precisely the way it it assesses a form of mass culture which is on the opposite end of the spectrum, a form of mass culture that is growing out of control. Here we have one that is not yet really established. In the United States, on the other hand, this kind of mass cultural profusion of photographic image culture cinema, photography, etc., has gotten to a point of absolute saturation. So the work of art edits it, stills it, interprets it, shapes it, reshapes it, as opposed to generating it. Both of these works, then, could be defined as modern with regard to how they create a relation to a mass cultural visual culture. And this definition of modern would therefore have nothing to do with the specific form that they work out of. So here, in a way, I suppose, is my very kind of telegraphic, very compressed punchline about what I mean by synchronization. This, the work by Wang Guanyi that I'm showing you in the middle of the slide here, his great one of several works collectively titled the Great Castigation series. This one, subtitled Coca-Cola from 1993. This is precisely the period in which Chinese contemporary art began to circulate in the West and was much valued and began to be collected and shown in Europe and the United States, as well as, well, not really quite being valued so much in China. That comes a little bit later. And here what you see is literally the synchronization of the two genealogies of the modern that I proposed to you a few moments ago. One, the socialist realist notion, which is here embodied in this reference to a woodcut print, which is one of the very common other forms of socialist realist visual culture, where these workers are holding the little red book of Mao, his sayings, holding a flag, and then the Coca-Cola blazon. The Coca-Cola trademark is emblazoned at the bottom. Just as you know, Warhol himself used Coca-Cola as well, focusing on both celebrities and commodities as a form of mass distributed profiles or identities in people and things. So this, in a sense, I would argue, this kind of a dual appropriation is a synchronization of Western and Chinese modes of creating the sense of a collective, one through identification with the trademark and the other through identification with a leader who some would argue is a kind of trademark in and of himself. And we saw how Mao attempted in some ways to do this. In the book, and I'll close here so we'll have time for discussion. In the book, what I tried to do is to argue that one of the most important aspects of the kind of appropriation that someone like Wang is doing here, appropriating both the Coca-Cola trademark and also the look of woodcuts, is to understand the different kinds of claims on this appropriated material that could be made. A claim on the one hand, from a Chinese perspective, that this heroic visual culture links to a history of the Cultural Revolution and of Chinese workers' governmentality. But in the West, this very same kind of Chinese material by the 90s would have been understood as a kind of revolutionary kitsch, where if you went to China, you could go to markets and thrift stores, flea markets, etc., and find all kinds of remnants of Cultural Revolution visual culture. So on the one hand, this might refer to a certain political genealogy within China, but from the West, it could refer at the same moment as a kind of debased commodification of a not disappeared, but a weakening form, a cultural revolutionary form of Maoist China. There are other ways we could think about these countering claims, but the point I'll just end by suggesting that the way I see the ready-made and its kind of aftermath of appropriation is in terms of a set of cultural claims over forms of aesthetic property, in terms of who has the rights or who has the desire to claim certain histories versus others, or to claim how certain histories are synchronized with others. And I would just say that this kind of cross current of cultural claims making has been at the heart of some of the most poignant aesthetic debates that we've had in recent years. For instance, the debate over Dana Schutz's picture in the Whitney, or the current debate around whether the Philip Guston show, which includes a series of paintings of sort of stylized Ku Klux Klan members, should have been postponed or not. It is precisely these varying claims coming from different cultural localities or positions over cultural properties as one's own or that of others that I think becomes the kind of aesthetic ground of contestation within global contemporary art. So I will stop there and stop sharing my screen, and we can.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
That was a lovely nugget of your book. I appreciated your giving us the bird's eye view and then zooming in onto a particular comparison in those last slides, and also connecting it to some of the recent and present struggles that your study of global contemporary art helps us see anew within the American context. I've prepared a number of questions which reflect on the book as a whole, as I've immersed myself in it in the past couple weeks. I do want to invite the audience to begin thinking of your questions and to take advantage of the time we have remaining with David to engage him about his really important book. You can pose a question in the chat, you can write it out, or you may raise your hand and I will call on you. So thank you so much for your scholarship, David. Your book has been profoundly disorienting for me in the best of ways, in that it decenters the white Euro-American art world. It also decenters much of the white Euro-American scholarship that has dominated discourses of contemporary art in the past decades. It does an incredible job of metabolizing 2 decades plus of contemporary art scholarship and forwarding the contributions of scholars of color. So the kind of bibliography alone, I think, is a wonderful kind of synchronization, to borrow your term, of contemporary art, global contemporary art scholarship. The book as a whole redefines and recalibrates a lot of known terms, right? Contemporaneity, modernity, tradition, heritage, the ready-made, appropriation, and pastiche, in order to account for how artists in the global South have positively mobilized these terms in their creation of global contemporary art. I was struck in particular with your recalibration of the case of pastiche, which in the United States in the 80s, of course, tended to be coded as regressive or neoconservative. But in the artists that you examine in the book, pastiche operates as a kind of reverse appropriation that leads to forms of cognitive justice, which is a term that you borrow from the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos, and which I first heard you speak about in a SCA panel in New York back in 2017, where these ideas were still simmering. The book overall presents us with a kind of systems theory for global contemporary art that sort of magisterially approaches numerous layers and players of an international network. You talk about artists, you talk about curators, collectors, institutions, and markets. My first question that I wanted to ask, as you present, you build out this incredible frame of reference as you spoke about it in the beginning of your talk, of your remarks. My first question is, what motivated you to write this book? And how does this frame of reference that you've built imagine a future study of global contemporary art as we now have increasing numbers of emerging scholars who are kind of coming out of the gate, identifying themselves in this way as global contemporary art historians?
Thank you, Natalie, for that, for all that you said just now, that for all the things you said about my book, which are very extremely gratifying. I should say that, I didn't set out with the idea of writing a book about global contemporary art or globalization, but I felt it was very important in my teaching to address the Eurocentrism of my own archive and I suppose more broadly of modernist and contemporary art history. I don't make a real distinction between modern and contemporary art so much. I want to kind of claim both of them as my, what I'm interested in. So so I just began trying to teach seminars on global contemporary art. I taught, I think, 3 at Yale and 1 undergraduate course there and 1 at the Graduate Center, I think, something along those lines. And I started really, it was really dumb, like dividing up the world among the different graduate students in the class in order to begin to try to think through both bibliography and also a framework for how one could make sense of this seemingly overwhelming vastness by suggesting a kind of paradigm or model. And so it took a lot of reading, teaching, and traveling to begin to feel that I had a kind of model that I could propose about for globalization. And, obviously, it's completely dependent upon what you were alluding. I think you were talking about an even younger generation, but there's a generation between maybe me and you guys who did amazing work in various on modern and contemporary art around the world and began to really build an incredible archive of totally original studies that made it possible, even if one travels a lot, even if one sees a lot of art, there's no way that one can sort of assemble the archive necessary to even begin to do some kind of reading of global contemporary art. So there is this, I think we're at this exciting moment when there are a lot of resources that give us very fine and expert histories of different regions of the world that within the Anglophone world of art history had not been available, certainly when I was in graduate school in the 1990s. So that has been essential. And what I think now, to go to the, part of the point of your symposium and also part of the thrust of your question is, of course, I'll just back up a little. I mean, I feel very conscious that, I've written this book with the limitations that I have in terms of languages, in terms of grasping cultures, in terms of degree of depth of research that I could do in different places. But what I've really come to think is that there are global methodologies that can be applied to all kinds of different archives. They don't all have to, and people are doing this now. I think younger scholars especially are realizing that to to meaningfully come to terms with globalization does not require trying to encompass a certain scale of geographical production. I mean, you can think in terms of regions, of vectors of migration of ideas and images. You know, there's been amazing work on the Black Atlantic. There's work on Southeast Asia that's extraordinarily comparative. And so I think in a way what's needed is a kind of comparativist focus on the one hand, and also a development of different kinds of models. I mean, I tried to propose this idea of heritage and debt, that to some degree history becoming a resource for asserting a certain kind of competitiveness in a global context, whether that means making new contemporary museums to attract capital in Singapore, or whether it means creating a place that people want to live, or allowing various kinds of art worlds to flourish, that there are different ways of thinking about globalization. It's not monolithic by any means. I think it's a perspective, and it's basically a comparatist perspective with a strong, I would say, materialist in the sense of, more in the sense of not Marx himself, but a kind of economic materialism that is important to it as well. And of course, and sorry, this long answer, this will be the last thing I say in response to your question, but I think that, you know, obviously it was, things are a little bit different now. And that most people have not been traveling for much, and that the nativisms and protectionisms that have been going on for a long time are getting kind of institutionalized, are becoming a way of life in a way that, you know, you couldn't have anticipated 9 months ago. So, you know, this book dropped at just that moment. I mean, Natalie and I, you know, empathize because both our books came out just as the pandemic happened. But so I think that, you know, there are many ways of thinking the global. And I think what's really important is to pluralize how we understand histories, and to explore comparativist methodologies in art history.
Yeah, thank you. We're already getting some great questions in the chat, so I'm actually going to curtail my questioning. I do have one more, and I can return to fill in case we have a lull. But one of my favorite terms that you deploy is synchronization, and at times it seems you wish to replace the contemporary with this term. And I was going to ask you to elaborate on that, but I think in a way you just did. But maybe we can return to it later. But what I did want to return to is, or sort of preview is your chapter 4, which a lot of us in the room did as a pre-read, your chapter on curated cultures. And it ends with a list of tactics that you describe having been used by the Congolese artists Sami Balogi and Patrick Mudekereza for a project that they did at the Royal Museums of Central Africa and Belgium. And it read to me almost like a manifesto for artists and curators who might wish to create, as you say, genuine epistemological change in the institutions in which they work and show towards a kind of de-imperialization, which in your book you distinguish from decolonization. And this moment in that chapter reminded me of another work of yours, your book on TV art, Namjoon Paik, Feedback, where you end the book with a manifesto. And so it made me wonder, in what ways does your book, you know, in this moment at the end of chapter 4, but in general, offer a kind of roadmap for ethically navigating this perilous terrain of global contemporary art, which you say, I think you say right in the beginning that you offer this kind of systems theory or this framework, which you're saying doesn't necessarily have a positive or negative valence. There are different ways to navigate it. So yeah, I guess my question again is, how does your book offer us a kind of roadmap for ethically navigating that terrain?
the last chapter is called Citizens of Information. And in a way, let's see, I just want to give some thought to how to say this in the clearest possible way. What I think contemporary art lets us do before there was a Donald Trump is to kind of parse the idea of what has been called now, probably forever, fake news. And I think that I wrote something, a kind of short polemical thing that came out of the books, the thinking for the book, but in a way, it gives a sense of my feeling about this. And that is that well, in my generation of scholars of contemporary art, but also critics of contemporary art who began working in the 1980s, were committed to the post-structuralist idea of breaking down canons, breaking down the a kind of despotism of authority on some level. And that's what, in, you know, if one wants to think generously about postmodernism, that's one of the things that it did. And I think that what we need now is what I kind of call for in the book as a kind of authorization, as opposed to a death of the author, which suggests that it is discourse that is primary, or a kind of adulation, over-representation of the author as the source or the kind of meaning behind the work. That the process of authorizing information, which includes images, is the job of the citizen. And I think that someone like Sami Belogi, for instance, is in effect, who you refer to, is doing that in his art practice. You know, he is authorizing a narrative of Congo that is suppressed otherwise, both through the museum and through his own work. And he reaggregates various histories in ways that isn't done in other realms. So I think that this way of, you know, the example I've used, I think I used it in the book and I've used it many times before, is that, you know, Colin Powell's many years ago using this grainy photograph to support the war in Iraq. That photograph was authorized by Colin Powell and by the State Department. I mean, the photograph itself was ridiculous. I mean, all of us on this Zoom, you know, I assume all or at least most of us know how to analyze an image, if nothing else. And that image proved nothing. It was authorized by the power that stood behind it. And it seems to me that this realm, this space of authorization is one that, in fact, we need to reclaim. And that means, if not making canons, really making narratives, explanatory narratives that shape experience in ways that can be authoritatively insisted upon. Because in the absence of that, we've seen what has happened. I mean, you know, I think the world we live in now, I don't want to get into name calling or facile, you know, political statements, but I think what one can agree upon is that there has been a rapid introduction of doubt into virtually any form of information that any of us consume, and also a balkanization of how information is authorized depending upon where it comes from. This, I think, is a possible site of real important work for both art and for intellectuals.
Thank you for that answer. You're giving me life. You're giving me faith in the future of our discipline. I don't see any hands raised, but please, people, don't be shy. And so in this case, I'm going to immediately ask my colleague Dorota to offer up a question from the chat.
Sure, we have plenty of excellent questions. The first one is from Lara De Mori. Thank you for your inspiring talk. how does this concept of synchronization differ from the notion of hybridity or hybridization, often used to define the contamination, for example, between Western and autochthonous influences present in Latin American contemporary artworks, for example?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. For me, what synchronization suggests is a kind of forcing, and a forcing together of things that may not want to be together, and that's how I think of basically distributed production that is the kind of mode of production of globalization, that sweatshops in Pakistan are being directed by bankers in New York and marketers in somewhere else, etc. So there is a kind of synchronization there that in fact is both repressive and about extracting value from difference. But then there are forms of synchronization that really do have to do with a potentially powerful encounter with alterity, which right now is what I think art can do, is to really offer profound experiences of alterity. And that could be looking at a Pollock painting, or it could be looking at Sami Balochi thinking about telling us what about the contradictions of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. So for me, synchronization really has to do with a lack of integration between these temporalities, and in fact, a real conflict between them, which can be exacerbated through the pressure that's placed on them to occupy the same temporality. Hybridity, in my view, and this may not be fully fair, but in my view, it's more a kind of absorptive idea, where the encounter of difference is accomplished somehow. Whereas I think with regard to synchronization, it's never quite accomplished. It's kind of like the tension remains.
I do have a question from Daniel Spalding, who couldn't raise his hand. So if you want to raise your hand and you can't figure out how, please, you can direct message me. And I also want to invite everybody in the room, if you feel comfortable, to turn on your camera so we can really sort of virtually feel like we're together. So Daniel, I'm going to ask you to unmute. See if this works.
Okay, great. Yeah, just easier to speak this. It's good to see you, David. It's been a while.
Good to see you too.
So in your presentation, I was struck by a resonance between what you were saying about Chinese cultural revolution era art and the role it had in creating a sense of collective identification, and then Benedict Anderson's argument regarding nationalism in imagined communities, which of course, focuses on print media rather than images, which might be an interesting sideline. But what really kind of occurred to me was that where the analogy might break down or need to be complicated is not actually so much in the Chinese context, but rather in how you were describing the privatization of the mass reproduced image in Warhol, where presumably you already have kind of like a more or less fully constituted public sphere that the artist is, slowing down and recontextualizing. But that public sphere in Warhol is, at least to a large extent, kind of like the commons of the commodity, or the sort of commoditized image, right? Or, more accurately, I guess, in early Warhol, at least, there's a kind of battle between what this public sphere is, whether it's this fully commoditized world versus one that's more political, along the lines of people like Tom Crow or Anne Wagner or Blake Stimson more recently have talked about, right? So there, when you had that kind of chiasmus diagram, the thing that I was thinking was like, well, maybe there's a kind of like fly in the ointment there, which is the commodity, right? And I have to apologize for mixing metaphors so much, fly in the ointment of the diagram. But what I'm saying is that there's sort of an asymmetry or non-synchronicity here that has to do with the socioeconomic system, right? Which does eventually get synchronized when China itself goes capitalist from the 80s onward. So I'm just sort of thinking about how that difference inflects your diagram, where you have these kind of two very different versions of what the public sphere is, right? And that diagram, I mean, I'll also just say, has a funny resonance with Krauss's expanded field, which is curious if it was intentional or not. But, you can take that on or not. So thanks.
Yeah, the Oedipus is always there, even when Oedipus is a woman, right? But yeah, I mean, what you're saying, Daniel, is really super, super important. And I think that what I want to, the way I want to answer it is, if God forbid I had to write this book now, having already written it, or another way of saying this is when I don't really want to teach global contemporary art the way I've written about it, but I do want to think about a kind of contested world of cultural properties and how because one of the things that I was thinking when you were speaking, this may not come out absolutely clear and direct, but you were talking about the commons of the commodity, which is a kind of, one of these bizarre paradoxes, oxymorons that feels absolutely not false, but nonetheless absolutely paradoxical. But I suppose the celebrity is the commons, right, of the commodity, and so we can have that image for free, even if we don't pay to go to the movies or whatever. And I think that what I was thinking when you were saying that is that really what Warhol's doing is he's enclosing that commons, right? I mean, he's found a way, kind of brilliantly, really, to extract value from the epiphenomenon of the commodity. And you could say, and I'm on thin ground because I don't really know enough about China to say this, but you could say that in a way, China wants that commons without the commodity, right? I mean, that they want to have it, but not to have the world that that led to us in that moment. I'm not that they could. I mean, it would be historically impossible to implant a kind of Western consumer culture in a generation. I mean, we've seen how those experiments don't work, in quite the way they're proposed to work. But as I say that, of course, in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, that is kind of what happened, right? I mean, but that's also 40 years later. So I guess I think a way of approaching this is to think about, what your question is very, very interesting to me, because it really suggests that when we have a commodity, you tend to think of the commodity as having, like if it's Coke, it's about buying the Coke and drinking it, and that's that. But then there's this whole other value that is its symbolic value, you could say, its epiphenomenal value, its cultural value. And that value is available for enclosure in various ways. And maybe that's what art has been since the 60s. I don't know. This isn't quite an answer, but I think I better stop there.
All right, I think we have more questions from the chat. Dorota?
Sure. We have a question from Cecilia Fajardo Hill. What is the role of women artists and gender within this effort to redefine the modernity, and modernism?
That's a really good question. I did, I'm trying to think how best to, because one of the things that I did in my book that is not really feminist, that is very old-fashioned, way of doing this is I thought a lot about gender equity in terms of the artists that I wrote about. But to be honest, I didn't really find that I did not approach globalization from a feminist point of view. And so that is definitely a kind of lack in the book because, well, I don't really have a good reason for that. I mean, it's kind of like I went to 70s feminism in terms of representation, but I did not theorize the global based on the kind of gender inequalities that structure global relations. I think that that was, I have no excuse for that, and I can't really defend myself on that, except to say that I think that the dynamics that I was interested in tended to open themselves to male artists in many of the regions that I touched upon. And so I think that I'm going to have to think about that further, really.
Thank you very much. Natalie, do we have more spoken questions, raised hands, voices?
We do not. But if you did pose a question in the chat and you're willing to voice it in your own voice, you can also raise your hand and then you can read your own question. The raise hand function is in the participants panel, so you'll have to open that up. And I believe there's a little hand that you can click on to raise. But maybe you should just proceed with another
Sure,
question.
yes. We have a question from Jay Shupinska-Myers. Thank you, David, for the provocative talk. It seems to me that early on you conflated the times of modernization, that is progress, the avant-garde, rupture. Is anything lost in absorbing the avant-garde so neatly into the modern in this way? The avant-garde was itself an important model for artists in Latin America, parts of Africa, and of course in China, like with Xiamen Dada and China avant-garde, among other examples.
Whenever you're trying to make a schema that pretends to capture this much stuff, there are going to be some simplifications. So one thing that I did was I too closely assimilated the avant-garde to the Euro-American or a Eurocentric genealogy of modernism. And now actually what I'm currently trying to work on is to think precisely this challenge within the European canon, that because I actually think that it's very true. Actually, this wasn't the question, but it's kind of how I'm taking the first take on it. It's quite true that the avant-garde was a drastic subset of Euro-American modernism, but it was the one that was kind of overrepresented. And so in a way it becomes a straw creature in my argument, but not entirely, because I do think that I will stand by the idea that art history still believes in a kind of succession of radical gestures, even if those radical gestures are about negation, failure, de-skilling, etc. But the more interesting point here is in the question, it seems to me, is the ways in which a kind of avant-garde energy can animate everywhere, that it doesn't have to be owned by the West. And that was, yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think that that's a really good point. My particular problem here was how to think debt in both a cultural and an economic sense. So debt in this book both stands in shorthand for neoliberal governance by debt, a kind of neoliberal world that global contemporary art lives in, but also the way in which non-Western art or art from these other genealogies of modernism that I've tried to sketch in the book tend to be understood as indebted to the West. So I wanted to really think about this problem, about to not pretend it doesn't exist, but rather to really think about how it has been met with and dealt with. And it seemed to me that deployments of heritage, of history, of cultural specificity as an opening to contemporaneity was the way that this happened. So you could call that avant-garde, but that wasn't the perspective that I took. So I mean, I think it's super interesting. This is what I mean by, I think that actually there's as many globalizations as there are archives that one can put together. And this is just one, this is one global dynamic that one can either accept or not, that I've tried to track through a certain set of cultures. But I think that this idea of acceleration of the avant-garde as a genuinely global capacity and potential would be an amazing project. I mean, it wasn't my project, but I'd love to see it and read it.
Great, thank you. In this case, I'm going to follow up with somewhat related question from Pepe Carmel. Chinese art in the 1950s and 60s went back and forth, sometimes violently, between propaganda images painted in the Western realist style in a more traditional Guahua style, less apt for propaganda. How should we, as non-Chinese viewers, connect to Guahua imagery to our own art historical perspectives?
Well, I think one of the interesting things, is that ink painting in China is still more popular than so-called global contemporary art. So, in fact, but this is one of those interesting, my book is not about art, all good art made in the contemporary period. So what is interesting about more traditional ink painting is that some kinds of projects launched from that tradition have been extremely successful in globalizing themselves. And those are the ones that open themselves to this kind of synchronization, where on the one end, often that carry with them a kind of self-conscious representation of that heritage for other audiences that may not have grown up through it. So I think those are the moments when it translates. But I think what doesn't translate, this is the other amazing thing about globalization, right? Is that not everything moves, so what doesn't move is just as interesting or perhaps more interesting than what does. And that's true in, I live mostly in New York and have for a long time. And, there are a lot of very well-known artists in New York City who are not global artists by, the kind of framework that I sort of loosely used in this book. They may, have extremely high profile careers, but their work doesn't translate in the same way. Or I shouldn't say translate, it doesn't seem susceptible to a certain degree of mobility that this kind of global category, I think, requires. And so that, I think, is a very interesting problem too. And that one that you're getting at, Pepe, that I think is really important to remember, that there are many, many, many registers here. The story is much more complex than any, Krauss-esque diagram could could encompass.
We
Great.
have our next question from a raised hand. Simon Lung, would you like to ask your question? Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Hi, David.
Hi, Simon.
Hi.
It's great to see you.
Wonderful to hear you, as always. As you were talking about the modality of the ready-made, it struck me that, especially because you gave the Wang Guanyi Coca-Cola example, it struck me that there are developments within what we think of as heritage that is also constantly changing, that is, in a sense, constantly being reframed. So if you were to go back, say 10 years before that, or into the 60s, as you did, socialist realism, or the type of Chinese socialist realism that was in place, was radically changed as a type of national narrative within China in the 80s, but especially in the 90s. And it's probably a reaction formation to Tiananmen Square, but not simply that. And what I mean by that is that from the idea, I'm just thinking about this on the level of national education, systematic national textbook education, from the idea of the international left, there began to develop a narrative of national humiliation within China, meaning how China was humiliated, by colonialism or the Japanese, whatever. And that became a spur towards a type of nationalist narrative within China that reached some fever pitches in the 21st century. But this is a narrative that is actively produced, that was not actively produced. Simultaneous to that, the other narrative that was actively produced is the possibility of China entering into a world economy with the appearance of civil society without actual civil society, right? So I think, and I bring up this issue of humiliation, if only because that is the affective tenor of the day, as we see in this country and in fascist states worldwide. So I just want to put that in there as a type of narrative that in fact produces the context under which certain desires facilitate themselves, including the desire of artists in the 1990s from China.
Yeah, I mean, that's so great, Simon. Thank you. I mean, and all I can really say, aside from appreciating that narrative, is that this is another fascinating model for a project that would be completely global, but the archive could be understood as national, right? Because it's like this work, and the whole story of socialist realism in China, which I cannot pretend to be any kind of expert in, is incredibly interesting because it also was a modernism because of its formal breaks, and there were moments of collaboration with the USSR and moments of relative reframing in extremely important ways. I mean, I suppose it's not unlike how, well, it's quite different, but maybe the energy is not unlike how the debates over monuments in this country have been going in recent years. So, what parts of history become, radioactive, and what parts of history become, a kind of resource for new forms of nationalism. So, and what narratives are directed to the population of the nation, and what narratives are directed outward. So, I could imagine an amazing global project that in fact, remained within Beijing, just for example. That's what I mean. I think there are all kinds of ways of rethinking the kind of problems that art history might think about, and this one activated by heritage in a different way. I mean, what do we do with this kind of cultural property, right? Like what is its social life in terms of its political utility or its economic utility in different contexts? Because in various places, including the USSR, the art market was, they self-consciously attempted to use it as a source of hard currency when Russian art began to, or Soviet art at the very end, began to circulate internationally. So there are many ways that this kind of cultural property, this heritage, gets framed and reframed, animated in various ways.
Thank you, Simon, for that question. You're reminding me of our mutual friend and colleague, Jenny Lin's recently published book, Above Sea, which I think does a nice job of that in the context of Shanghai. If you don't mind, David, I would like to offer up our last question to Celia Glastris, and that will conclude our conversation. And I apologize to those of you who we didn't get to, and I heartily encourage you to join our future events. So Celia, I believe.
Yeah. So I'm going to read what I wrote already in the chat, but I'm going to try to segue off of what Simon said. So basically making up my own words, but the ready-made of heritage is so potent, and like you can just sell it majorly right now, especially as an art form. But as well as like what you were talking about, whereas authorizing is now the reader's job, not so much as the death of the author, and you're not making canons, but explaining narratives. In the age of in the age of identity politics, where everything is having to be explained by their own narrative, how do you go about making an ethical viewpoint of history or the contemporary without exploiting people's own experiences?
Well, what I guess, I alluded to this earlier, but I guess what really interests me the most now are these debates over who can claim authority over an image. Like, I really think that the Dana Schutz issue around the Emmett Till painting was incredibly important. I mean, to me, it was the most interesting thing that happened in contemporary art in the last 10 years. And I think that if it was within the last 10 years, I'm not very good at chronology. But because I think it showed that, well, now I may get in a little bit of trouble, but I think that there is this sanctification of art in a way where, people think that art is virtuous. And I love art, and I do think it has virtues, but I don't think that every use of a cultural property can be explained away through the privileges of art. And I think that what is really interesting about these debates, and as I mentioned, the Guston one is the one that's happening, just now, is that you see how people defend art as a kind of zone of exception, where violences that would not be tolerated elsewhere are have a place where they can occur. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. I mean, I actually find it very difficult to be on a side in all of these things, and actually less interesting to just sort of say, I think this, I think it's super interesting to try to understand why people think that making a violent image as art somehow undoes the violence or makes the violence accessible in a different way. And again, I don't have an answer for that, but I think that to me, that's sort of the most interesting problem right now. And I think it has to do with the questions of appropriation that you were bringing up, and with ethics. You know, you're muted.
Oh, did the question asker want to respond?
I think so.
Hoping that she would respond back. Celia, where did you go? I have to endlessly scroll. Here we go. Did you want to come back?
Yeah, it's not that I'm talking about like violent images. It's just that the like not history, but like the way that you're setting things up, it's that there needs to be an explanation that comes from those people that like this I don't remember who, Sammy
Belogi, yeah.
Belogi. That puts Sammy Belogi in the place of explaining himself. So what do you do with that? There's I know that's an ethics thing.
Yeah.
That's what I'm wondering about.
No, yeah, I mean, and this might, I don't think anyone has to explain themselves.
Yeah.
I think they have to defend their choices when you know, they are challenged in the world, which means that it's good to know why you're doing what you're doing and to have thought as carefully as possible about it. Even then, it's, you know, that's no guarantee that one isn't going to run into problems. But I think that, yeah, I don't think artists should be, I mean, I know this might sound contradictory, but I don't really think it is. I think people should be able to do whatever they want. But I also think that the world in which those things come also have a right to say, you know, that's not okay, you know, and that's what interests me. And this is where I think that, you know, art really, you know, these controversies I find very fundamental to the kind of moment we're living in. And it's a different thing from identity politics. I think it really has to do with, as you're kind of stating it, struggles over the kind of ethical claims on cultural property is how I'd put it. It's a little, you know, stilted, that phrase, but it's specifically what I'm trying to point to. And I think that's quite different from identity, actually. Okay, we can stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. Thank you everyone for asking questions. I encourage you all to join us next Tuesday for Mary Carmen Ramirez's presentation. There's registration information in the chat. And just so that we can show David our full appreciation, I'm going to allow you all to unmute yourselves and we can actually give him like our legitimate round of applause before we end our call. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Bye.